something strange is happening. Not quietly, not slowly, but faster than anyone expected. An entire generation is walking away from religion, not in rebellion, but in silence. Millennials aren't angry at God. They're not trying to destroy faith. Most of them didn't even have a dramatic exit. They just stopped showing up. And here's the uncomfortable part. It's not because they're lazy. It's not because they're immoral. And it's definitely not because they hate tradition. It's because religion stopped answering the questions that mattered most. Tonight, we're not going to attack belief. We're going to expose why it stopped working and what that says about truth, authority, and the modern mind. Because once you see the real reason, you can't unsee it. The silent exit. Previous generations fought religion with noise and fire. They argued in public squares. They wrote angry books. They marched, protested, and tried to replace belief with something new. Millennials did something far more unsettling. They simply drifted away. Quietly. Gradually. Almost politely. No protests. No burning books. No dramatic declarations of disbelief. One day they were there, the next day they were busy, and eventually they were gone. Attendance declined first, not out of rebellion but convenience. Work schedules changed, weekends filled up, screens replaced sermons, then belief weakened. Not because someone disproved God, but because the rituals stopped feeling necessary, and finally, identity dissolved. Being religious was no longer something you were, it became something you used to be. Faith did not collapse overnight. It faded, slowly, softly, almost invisibly. Like a language no longer spoken at home, religion once answered life's biggest fears with confidence. What happens when we die? Why suffering exists? Where we belong in the world? Those answers were once rare and guarded. Now they are everywhere. Millennials grew up surrounded by alternative explanations. Psychology explained pain. Science explained origins. Online communities replaced local congregations. Meaning came from careers, creativity, relationships, and self-expression. When answers come from many places, no single voice feels absolute. And when something no longer feels essential, it becomes optional. Optional beliefs are fragile. They survive only when convenient. But the silent exit was not sudden. It began much earlier, long before adulthood. It started in childhood classrooms that encouraged questioning, but religious spaces that discouraged it. It started with moral lessons that sounded beautiful, yet clashed with real-world behavior. It started with feeling watched, judged, or constrained rather than understood. Over time, the emotional connection weakened. Not because millennials hated religion, but because it stopped feeling like it was speaking to their lives. When belief no longer reflects lived reality, people do not rebel, they disengage. And disengagement is far more dangerous than opposition, because no one argues with something they have already stopped needing. Information broke the monopoly. For centuries, religion held a monopoly on truth, not because it was always correct, but because it was the only voice in the room. If you wanted meaning, you went to a priest. If you wanted morality, you turned to scripture. If you wanted answers about life, death, and purpose, you listened and obeyed. Authority was not questioned because there was nothing to compare it to. Truth felt singular because it was isolated. Then the internet arrived. Quietly at first, slowly, then all at once. Suddenly, a teenager sitting in their bedroom could fact-check a sermon in real time. They could compare doctrines across cultures in minutes. They could read history without filters, without institutions deciding which parts were safe and which were dangerous. Information was no longer scarce. It was overwhelming. And with that flood of access came a realization that no generation before could avoid. If truth is real, why does it change depending on geography? Why does salvation look different in different countries? Why is one holy book unquestionable here and completely unknown somewhere else? This question was not asked out of arrogance, it was asked out of confusion, and confusion is the beginning of doubt. Once authority has to compete with information, authority loses its invisibility. It must explain itself, defend itself, justify itself, and many institutions were not prepared for that. They were built for obedience, not dialogue, for certainty, not scrutiny. But information alone did not destroy belief. People have always had access to ideas that challenged faith. What changed was trust. When institutions reacted to questions with fear, defensiveness, or silence, they revealed fragility. Instead of saying, "We do not know," they insisted they always had. And that was the deeper rupture. Millennials did not stop believing because they learned too much. They stopped believing because they saw that belief was protected, not strengthened, by ignorance. Once that realization settles in, faith no longer feels sacred, it feels managed. And managed truth is the fastest way to lose credibility. Moral contradictions became impossible to ignore. Millennials did not reject morality. In many ways, they cared about it more than any generation before them. They talked about fairness, empathy, inclusion, and harm. They questioned power. They worried about the impact of their choices on others. What they rejected was moral inconsistency. The gap between what was preached and what was practiced became impossible to ignore. They were taught compassion, then watched exclusion play out in real time. They heard sermons about loving everyone, yet saw certain people quietly pushed to the margins. They were taught humility, then witnessed institutions protect status, wealth, and influence. They were taught love, then observed judgment delivered with certainty and no curiosity. The message sounded beautiful. The behavior felt different. At first, many tried to reconcile the two. They assumed they misunderstood. They blamed individuals instead of systems. They told themselves that no institution is perfect. But the contradictions kept repeating, and repetition turns doubt into pattern recognition. When millennials asked questions, they were not trying to provoke. They were trying to align values with reality. They asked why certain rules existed, why some lives were treated as less worthy, why harm was justified in the name of tradition. And often, the response was not dialogue, it was deflection. Have faith. Do not question. Trust the process. But faith only works when trust exists. Trust is built through transparency, accountability, and moral consistency. It dissolves under hypocrisy. When an institution claims moral authority but resists moral scrutiny, that authority begins to feel performative rather than principled. Once moral authority cracks, obedience becomes optional. People no longer follow because they believe. They comply because it is expected. An expectation without conviction is fragile. Yet this was not the only fracture forming beneath the surface. There was another one, quieter and more personal. It did not show up in debates or doctrine. It showed up in moments of pain, confusion, and unanswered prayers. And that is where the tension deepened even further. Suffering without answers. Previous generations were taught to accept suffering as fate. Pain was framed as a test, a lesson, or a necessary part of a divine plan. You endured it quietly, believing that meaning would be revealed later, if not in this life, then in the next. Millennials inherited that language, but they did not inherit the same patience for unexplained pain. They demanded explanations, not to rebel, but to survive. They asked questions that were deeply human and deeply personal. Why do innocent people suffer? Why does prayer go unanswered in moments of real desperation? Why does belief feel distant precisely when it is needed most? These were not philosophical puzzles. They were cries for clarity during loss, illness, depression, and injustice. The answers, however, did not evolve. God has a plan. Everything happens for a reason. Just trust. These phrases were repeated so often that they began to lose meaning. What once sounded comforting began to feel dismissive, not because the ideas were cruel, but because they were vague. They asked for surrender when people were asking for understanding. When suffering is abstract, platitudes can survive. When it becomes personal, they collapse. A grieving person does not need a slogan, they need presence. Someone struggling does not need certainty. They need honesty. Millennials were not asking religion to fix suffering. They were asking it to sit with uncertainty without pretending to have all the answers. Instead, many institutions doubled down on certainty. They treated doubt as weakness and questions as threats. But certainty without evidence feels hollow when pain is real. It can even feel manipulative, as if confidence is being used to mask ignorance. Millennials did not leave because they wanted chaos. They left because they could no longer accept answers that prioritized control over compassion. When religion chose certainty over truth, it lost credibility. Not suddenly, but decisively. And this set the stage for the real turning point. Because once belief stops helping people make sense of suffering, they begin to look elsewhere. And what they found would change everything. Identity outgrew tradition. Religion once defined identity in clear, unquestioned ways. It told you who you were, where you belonged, and what role you were expected to play. Family was not just personal, it was spiritual. Community was not optional, it was sacred. Purpose was assigned long before it was discovered. Identity was inherited, not explored. Millennials grew up in a different world. A world where identity was something you shaped rather than something you accepted. Sexuality was not a secret to suppress, but a truth to understand. Belief was not fixed, but examined. Purpose was not given, it was searched for. From an early age, they were encouraged to ask who they were, not just who they were supposed to be. In that environment, institutions that demanded conformity began to feel suffocating, not protective, not grounding, suffocating. When rules define worth and belonging depends on compliance, identity becomes fragile. People start to edit themselves to fit the space, instead of growing into who they are. When belief requires shrinking yourself, belief becomes a cage. Even if the cage is beautiful, even if it promises safety, a life that demands silence around parts of the self creates internal conflict. Over time, that conflict becomes unbearable. This generation did not reject spirituality. Many remained deeply curious about meaning, connection, and transcendence. What they rejected was being told who they were allowed to be in order to access those things. They rejected the idea that authenticity had to be sacrificed for acceptance, or that certain questions made them unworthy. Religion had once offered a home for identity. For many millennials, it began to feel like a costume that no longer fit. And when something no longer fits, you can adjust it, or you can step out of it entirely. But identity was only part of the story. Beneath it was a deeper shift, one that moved meaning itself away from institutions and into the inner world. And that shift would change how belief functioned forever. Meaning moved inward. For most of history, religion externalized meaning. It placed it outside the individual. Meaning lived in rules you followed, rituals you performed, and rewards you were promised. If you lived correctly, meaning would arrive. If you obeyed, clarity would be granted. Purpose came from alignment with something higher and distant. Millennials grew up experiencing meaning differently. They internalized it. Instead of looking outward for moral judgment, they began looking inward for understanding. Mental health conversations replaced confession booths. Therapy replaced absolution. Self-reflection replaced dogma. Not because religion failed, but because psychology explained what religion never could. Anxiety was no longer a spiritual weakness. It was something to understand. Guilt was no longer proof of sin. It was a signal to examine boundaries and values. Trauma was no longer framed as a test. It was something to heal. These frameworks did not demand blind obedience. They demanded awareness. Meaning stopped coming from above and started forming within. Identity, values, and purpose were constructed through experience, introspection, and growth. When people understood why they felt what they felt, they no longer needed an external authority to interpret their inner world for them. Once meaning becomes internal, authority becomes unnecessary. Not aggressively rejected, just quietly bypassed. Guidance is no longer accepted because of status. It is accepted only if it resonates with lived experience. This shift did not make people selfish, it made them responsible. They could no longer outsource their moral reasoning or emotional well-being. But this inward turn came with a cost. Without shared frameworks, meaning became personal but fragmented. Without collective rituals, people felt free but untethered. The same tools that liberated individuals also isolated them. And that created a dangerous vacuum, a space where certainty was gone, but nothing had fully replaced it. And into that vacuum rushed anxiety, confusion, and new belief systems just as rigid as the old ones. Freedom is terrifying. Here is the paradox almost no one talks about. Leaving religion did not immediately bring peace. For many, it brought something far heavier: responsibility. When belief fades, so does the sense that someone else is in control. There is no divine plan quietly unfolding in the background, no cosmic safety net guaranteeing that things will make sense in the end. No external justification to lean on when life hurts or choices go wrong. There is only choice, and choice is heavy. Every decision now belongs to you. Every value must be examined and chosen rather than inherited. Every mistake feels sharper because there is no larger narrative to absorb it. Freedom removes excuses along with comfort. It asks you to stand alone with your consequences. Some people could not tolerate that weight. They ran back to belief, not because they were convinced, but because certainty feels safer than ambiguity. Others clung to ideology, politics, movements, identities, anything that offered rules, enemies, and moral clarity. These systems looked different on the surface, but they functioned the same way. They reduced complexity. They told people what to think and who to blame. Many stayed lost, drifting between ideas, unsure what to anchor themselves to. They felt free, but also untethered, empowered, yet anxious. Freedom without structure can feel like floating in open water with no shore in sight. But once you have tasted freedom, you cannot unknow it. You cannot unsee that belief was once chosen for you. You cannot return to obedience without awareness. Even when people go back, they go back changed. Questioning does not disappear. Doubt becomes permanent background noise. And that is where everything truly changes. Because freedom does not end the search for meaning. It intensifies it. It forces people to confront what they actually believe, not what they were told to believe. And that confrontation reshapes faith, identity, and the future of belief itself. This isn't the end of belief. Religion is not dying. What is disappearing is blind belief, the kind of belief that demands loyalty without understanding, the kind that asks for obedience before trust is earned. Millennials did not abandon meaning. In many ways, they are more obsessed with it than ever. What they abandoned was unquestioned authority. They did not wake up one day and decide to reject God. Many still pray. Many still search. Many still feel awe, gratitude, and transcendence. What they rejected were intermediaries who claimed exclusive access to truth, institutions that spoke for the divine while refusing accountability, leaders who demanded trust but resisted transparency. The old model assumed belief flowed downward, from scripture to leader to follower. That model depends on silence and hierarchy. Millennials disrupted it by asking simple questions. Who decides what is true? Why this interpretation and not another? Why does doubt feel like betrayal? The future will not be faithless, it will be selective. Belief will no longer be inherited automatically. It will be chosen carefully, tested against experience, and held loosely rather than defended aggressively. Traditions that adapt, listen, and admit uncertainty will survive. Those that rely on fear, shame, or unquestioned authority will continue to fade. Belief will survive, but only where honesty exists, where leaders say we do not know instead of pretending they do, where questions are treated as curiosity rather than threats, where morality is lived, not just spoken. This is the real shift, not a collapse of spirituality, but a transformation of it. Faith is no longer about submission, it is about alignment. And alignment requires integrity. That demand will not go away. It will only grow stronger as generations continue to ask not what they are supposed to believe, but what actually feels true. So why are millennials leaving religion faster than ever? Not because they hate tradition, not because they're lost, not because they're immoral, but because belief now has competition. Truth can be questioned. Authority must earn trust. Meaning must feel real. Religion once answered humanity's fears. Now humanity wants answers that don't require silence. This isn't the fall of faith, it's the rise of discernment. And whether that leads to deeper belief or deeper doubt depends on one thing: your willingness to question what you were handed. If this made you uncomfortable, good. If it made you think, even better. And if you value truth over comfort, stay curious, subscribe, and don't stop asking why.